In the early 1950s, the United States stood as a nation divided against its own ideals. To the outside world, America projected confidence and moral authority, presenting itself as the leader of the free world during the Cold War. Government officials spoke passionately about democracy, liberty, and human rights, contrasting American values with the oppression of communist regimes. Movies, speeches, and textbooks celebrated freedom as the core of the American identity. Yet beneath this powerful image lay a painful and undeniable reality. Millions of African Americans were denied basic rights, dignity, and opportunities because of the color of their skin. This contradiction was not a minor flaw, but a central crisis that defined American society in the early 1950s. In the southern United States, racial segregation was enforced through Jim Crow laws, which legally separated black and white citizens in nearly every aspect of daily life. Segregation shaped where people could live, learn, eat, travel, work, and even be buried. Public schools were divided by race, with black schools receiving far less funding, outdated materials, and overcrowded classrooms. Public transportation forced African Americans to sit in separate sections or give up their seats entirely. Restaurants, movie theaters, hotels, parks, libraries, restrooms, and hospitals all followed strict racial boundaries. These laws were enforced by police and courts, making segregation not just a social custom but a system backed by the full power of the state. The conditions created by segregation were designed to humiliate and control. Facilities for African Americans were almost always inferior, sending a constant message of racial hierarchy. In many towns, signs clearly marked spaces as white-only or colored, reminding black citizens of their assigned place in society. Breaking these rules, even unintentionally, could result in arrest, violence, or death. Fear became a normal part of life, shaping behavior and limiting freedom in ways that white Americans rarely experienced or understood. Economic discrimination further reinforced racial inequality. African Americans were largely excluded from well-paying jobs and professional careers regardless of their education or skills. Most were confined to low-wage labor such as farm work, factory jobs, or domestic service. Unions often excluded black workers, and employers routinely paid them less than white employees for the same work. Housing discrimination was widespread, forcing African American families into overcrowded neighborhoods with poor infrastructure and limited access to quality healthcare, sanitation, and public services. Government policies and banking practices denied loans to black families, making it nearly impossible to build wealth or move into better neighborhoods. Political power was systematically denied to African Americans, especially in the South. Although the Constitution guaranteed voting rights, states used poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses to block black citizens from the ballot box. These tests were applied unfairly and designed to fail African Americans, while allowing white voters to pass easily. Those who attempted to register often faced threats, job loss, eviction, or physical violence. Without voting power, African Americans had little influence over the laws that governed their lives, allowing segregation to continue without democratic challenge. Violence was a constant tool used to enforce racial control. Lynching, though less common than in earlier decades, remained a terrifying threat. These acts were meant not only to punish individuals, but to terrorize entire communities into submission. Police brutality against African Americans was widespread, and the justice system rarely held perpetrators accountable. All-white juries often acquitted those accused of racial violence, reinforcing the belief that the law existed to protect white supremacy rather than justice. This failure of the legal system deepened mistrust and fear within black communities. Despite these harsh realities, African Americans had never stopped resisting oppression. Long before the 1950s, black leaders, educators, and organizations had been challenging discrimination through legal action, education, and community organizing. The NAACP played a critical role by strategically challenging segregation in the courts, gathering evidence to prove that separate but equal was a lie. Black newspapers documented injustices ignored by mainstream media, keeping communities informed and united. Teachers and parents quietly taught children self-respect, history, and the belief that equality was both deserved and achievable. The Black church emerged as the strongest and most trusted institution within African American communities. Churches were not only places of worship, but centers of leadership, organization, and communication. Ministers were respected figures who could mobilize people and provide moral guidance. Sermons connected Christian teachings with the struggle for justice, emphasizing dignity, patience, sacrifice, and hope. This spiritual foundation would later become essential to the philosophy of nonviolent resistance, giving people the strength to face suffering without surrendering to hatred. World War II profoundly shaped the mindset of African Americans. More than 1 million Black Americans served in the military, fighting for freedom and democracy overseas. They risked their lives wearing the uniform of a nation that denied them equality at home. When these soldiers returned, they expected change, or at least recognition of their sacrifice. Instead, they encountered the same segregation, discrimination, and humiliation. This contradiction fueled anger, determination, and a renewed commitment to challenge injustice. The idea of fighting for freedom abroad while being denied it at home became impossible to accept. Economic and social changes after the war further strengthened demands for equality. The Great Migration continued as African Americans moved from the rural South to cities in the North and West. Urban centers offered greater job opportunities, access to education, and exposure to new political ideas. Although racism existed nationwide, these cities provided more space for organizing and activism. Black communities grew in size and influence, creating networks that would later support mass protests and national movements. Education became one of the most visible symbols of inequality. Segregated schools for African American children were severely underfunded, with outdated textbooks, overcrowded classrooms, and poorly maintained buildings. Many Black students traveled long distances to attend school, passing better-equipped white schools every day. Parents understood that unequal education limited their children's futures and reinforced generational poverty. This awareness strengthened support for legal challenges to school segregation and increased community involvement in the fight for equality. The broader political climate of the early 1950s added another layer of difficulty. The Red Scare and fear of communism created an environment in which social activism was often viewed with suspicion. Civil rights advocates were sometimes labeled as radicals or communists, a tactic used to silence criticism and discredit legitimate demands for justice. This made organizing even more dangerous, especially in the South, where activists already faced violence and intimidation. Speaking openly about civil rights required extraordinary bravery. Women played a vital but often overlooked role in sustaining African American communities during this period. As mothers, teachers, church organizers, and workers, they maintained the social networks that held communities together. Many faced both racial and gender discrimination, yet their resilience ensured that families survived and movements endured. Their quiet leadership, daily sacrifices, and determination formed the backbone of the struggle long before national attention arrived. Media representation reflected the racial inequalities of the era. Mainstream newspapers and television often ignored Black voices or portrayed African Americans through negative stereotypes. Stories of racial violence were minimized or framed in ways that blamed victims rather than perpetrators. In response, Black-owned newspapers and radio stations became essential platforms for truth, resistance, and unity. These media outlets connected local struggles to a national audience, helping African Americans realize that their experiences were shared across the country. By the early 1950s, the pressure for change was building steadily. Legal challenges were weakening segregation, grassroots networks were strengthening, and moral arguments against racial injustice were becoming impossible to ignore. International criticism also increased, as other nations questioned how the United States could claim moral leadership while denying equality to its own citizens. The contradiction between American ideals and American reality grew more visible and more uncomfortable with each passing year. This era was marked not by dramatic marches or famous speeches, but by quiet endurance and preparation. Ordinary people faced daily humiliation, yet they also nurtured hope, discipline, and determination. Communities learned how to organize, leaders began to emerge, and strategies were slowly developed. The early 1950s represented the calm before a historic transformation, a moment when injustice remained deeply rooted. But change had become inevitable. From this foundation of suffering, resilience, and moral conviction, the civil rights movement would soon rise to challenge the conscience of the nation and permanently reshape American history. By the mid-1950s, the civil rights movement entered a new and decisive phase, marked by the rise of a young leader whose voice, vision, and moral clarity would transform American history. Martin Luther King Jr. was not yet a national figure, but the conditions of the time were quietly shaping him for leadership. Born in 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia, King grew up in a deeply religious household where faith, education, and social responsibility were central values. His father and grandfather were Baptist ministers, and from an early age King witnessed both the pain of racial discrimination and the strength that faith could provide in confronting it. These early experiences laid the foundation for his belief that injustice could be challenged through moral courage rather than violence. King was a gifted student who pursued higher education with seriousness and purpose. He studied theology and philosophy, eventually earning a doctorate. During his academic journey, he encountered the ideas of Mahatma Gandhi, whose philosophy of nonviolent resistance deeply influenced him. Gandhi's success in challenging British colonial rule through peaceful protest convinced King that nonviolence was not a sign of weakness, but a powerful force capable of transforming society. At the same time, King's Christian faith reinforced the belief that love, forgiveness, and moral integrity could overcome hatred and oppression. These ideas would soon be tested in the harsh reality of the segregated American South. The turning point in King's life came in December 1955 in Montgomery, Alabama, when Rosa Parks, a quiet but determined African-American seamstress, refused to give up her seat to a white passenger on a segregated city bus. She was arrested. Her act of resistance was not spontaneous rebellion, but a deliberate challenge to an unjust system. Local civil rights leaders saw an opportunity to confront segregation directly, and they organized a citywide bus boycott. African Americans were asked to stop using public buses until segregation ended. This was a risky strategy, as buses were a primary means of transportation for many black workers. But the community responded with remarkable unity. Martin Luther King Jr., then a 26-year-old pastor at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, was chosen to lead the newly formed Montgomery Improvement Association. His youth, education, and calm demeanor made him a suitable figure who could unify diverse voices. At the first mass meeting of the boycott, King delivered a speech that revealed his extraordinary leadership potential. He spoke not with anger or revenge, but with dignity and moral authority, emphasizing that the protest would remain peaceful despite provocation. His words resonated deeply, transforming fear into determination and uncertainty into collective strength. The Montgomery bus boycott lasted for more than a year, testing the endurance of the black community. People walked miles to work, organized carpool systems, and endured harassment and threats. King himself became a target. His home was bombed, and he was arrested, yet he consistently urged protesters to reject violence. Instead of responding with hatred, he called for discipline, courage, and love. This commitment to nonviolence was not easy. It required immense self-control in the face of constant danger. However, it also exposed the moral bankruptcy of segregation, as peaceful protesters were met with brutality and injustice. The boycott ultimately succeeded. In 1956, the United States Supreme Court ruled that segregation on public buses was unconstitutional. This victory was more than a local triumph. It demonstrated that organized, nonviolent mass protest could bring real change. Martin Luther King Jr. emerged from Montgomery as a national leader, symbolizing a new kind of resistance, one rooted in moral persuasion rather than physical force. Newspapers and television brought his image and message into homes across the country, introducing many Americans to the realities of segregation for the first time. Following Montgomery, King became increasingly active on the national stage. He helped establish the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, an organization designed to coordinate nonviolent protest across the South. The SCLC brought together ministers and community leaders who shared a commitment to peaceful resistance. King's role was not that of a dictator or commander, but of a moral guide who inspired others to act. He emphasized that the movement's goal was not to defeat white Americans, but to awaken their conscience and create a society based on justice and equality for all. King's philosophy of nonviolence was both ethical and strategic. He believed that violence would only deepen racial divisions and justify further repression. Nonviolent protest, on the other hand, forced the nation to confront the reality of injustice without the distraction of riots or retaliation. When peaceful demonstrators were beaten, arrested, or attacked, the contrast between their dignity and their treatment exposed the cruelty of segregation. King understood the power of media in shaping public opinion, and nonviolence ensured that images of injustice would provoke sympathy rather than fear. During this period, King also developed his powerful speaking style, which blended religious imagery, constitutional ideals, and universal moral principles. He frequently referenced the Declaration of Independence and the Bible, framing civil rights as a fulfillment of America's founding promises rather than a radical departure from them. This approach allowed him to connect with a wide audience, including moderate whites who might otherwise have been resistant to change. His speeches did not simple. Why demand rights? They invited Americans to live up to their own ideals. Leadership, however, came at a heavy personal cost. King and his family lived under constant threat. He received daily death threats, was frequently arrested, and endured relentless criticism. Some accused him of moving too fast, while others claimed he was not radical enough. Despite this pressure, King remained committed to his principles. He understood that leadership meant sacrifice, and that progress often required enduring pain without losing moral clarity. The rise of Martin Luther King Jr. marked a shift in the civil rights movement, from isolated legal battles to mass participation. Ordinary people, maids, factory workers, students, and ministers, began to see themselves as agents of change. Nonviolence gave them a method that did not require weapons or physical power, only courage and discipline. Through boycotts, marches, and speeches, a movement began to take shape that challenged the foundations of segregation across the South. By the end of the 1950s, King had become more than a leader, he had become a symbol of hope. His message suggested that America could be transformed without destroying itself, that justice and reconciliation could go hand in hand. This vision was both inspiring and unsettling, forcing the nation to confront uncomfortable truths. The foundations laid during this period would soon support larger campaigns, greater sacrifices, and historic victories. The rise of Martin Luther King Jr., and the commitment to nonviolent resistance reshaped the struggle for civil rights, turning it into a moral movement that would change the course of American history. As the leadership of Martin Luther King Jr. gained national attention, the broader civil rights movement of the 1950s entered a critical and highly visible stage. This decade was defined by a series of major events that pushed racial injustice into the center of American life and forced the federal government, the courts, and ordinary citizens to confront segregation directly. These events did not occur in isolation. They were connected by shared courage, collective sacrifice, and an increasing willingness among African Americans to challenge a system that had oppressed them for generations. One of the most important turning points came in 1954 with the Supreme Court decision in Brown v. Board of Education. This landmark ruling declared that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional, directly overturning the long-standing doctrine of separate but equal. The court recognized that segregated education was inherently unequal and deeply damaging to black children. For African Americans, this decision represented a long-awaited legal victory and a symbol of hope. It suggested that the highest court in the nation was finally willing to acknowledge the injustice at the heart of segregation. However, the Brown decision also revealed how deeply entrenched racism was in American society. Many Southern states responded with open defiance rather than compliance. Politicians issued statements promising massive resistance. And some states passed laws designed to delay or block integration. Public schools were shut down rather than integrated, and white citizens' councils formed to preserve segregation through economic and social pressure. This resistance made it clear that legal rulings alone would not be enough to dismantle segregation. Sustained activism and federal enforcement would be required. Education became a frontline battleground, symbolizing both the promise and the danger of progress. Black families who attempted to integrate white schools faced harassment, threats, and violence. Children were often the first to bear the burden of change, forced to walk past angry mobs simply to attend class. Their courage exposed the cruelty of segregation in a way that words alone could not. Images of frightened, yet determined black students surrounded by hostile crowds shocked the nation and challenged Americans to reconsider their beliefs. One of the most dramatic confrontations occurred in 1957 in Little Rock, Arkansas, when 9 African American students attempted to enroll at Little Rock Central High School. They were met by violent white mobs encouraged by the state's governor. Local authorities refused to protect the students, effectively supporting segregationist resistance. The situation escalated into a national crisis, drawing widespread media attention. President Dwight D. Eisenhower ultimately intervened, sending federal troops to escort the students and enforce integration. This movement demonstrated that the federal government could no longer remain neutral, and that civil rights had become a national issue rather than a regional one. The Little Rock crisis had lasting consequences. It showed African Americans that federal power could, under pressure, be used to protect their rights. At the same time, it fueled resentment among segregationists, increasing hostility toward the movement. The presence of soldiers escorting children to school revealed the extreme measures required to enforce basic constitutional rights, underscoring the depth of resistance to racial equality. Beyond schools, grassroots activism expanded rapidly throughout the South during the late 1950s. Sit-ins, boycotts, and peaceful demonstrations began to spread from city to city. African Americans challenged segregation in libraries, parks, transportation systems, and public buildings. These actions were often led by local organizers rather than national figures, proving that the movement was not dependent on a single leader. Students, workers, and church members organized themselves, drawing inspiration from earlier successes and adapting nonviolent tactics to their own communities. These protests were frequently met with arrests, violence, and intimidation. Peaceful demonstrators were beaten, jailed, and harassed by police. Many lost their jobs or faced economic retaliation for participating in protests. Despite this, the movement continued to grow. Each act of repression revealed the injustice of segregation more clearly, strengthening public sympathy for civil rights activists. Television and newspapers played a crucial role, bringing images of brutality into living rooms across the nation, and making it increasingly difficult to ignore the reality of racial oppression. Legal challenges remained an essential part of the movement during this period. Civil rights lawyers worked tirelessly to challenge discriminatory laws in court, building on the momentum of the Brown decision. Each case chipped away at the legal foundations of segregation, even as resistance persisted. The combination of courtroom victories and street-level activism created a powerful dynamic, forcing institutions to respond on multiple fronts. The late 1950s also saw the emergence of young activists who would later become central figures in the movement. College students and high school students began to question the pace of change and the patience required by nonviolent protest. While they shared the commitment to nonviolence, they brought new energy and urgency to the struggle. Their involvement signaled that the movement was not fading but evolving, preparing for even larger confrontations in the years ahead. Religious institutions continued to play a critical role in sustaining activism. Churches provided meeting spaces, financial support, and moral encouragement. Sermons reinforced the belief that the struggle for civil rights was a righteous cause, aligning faith with action. This spiritual dimension gave many activists the strength to endure suffering without surrendering to despair or hatred. At the same time, opposition to the movement hardened. White supremacist groups intensified their activities, using fear and violence to discourage change. Bombings, assassinations, and threats became more common. Law enforcement agencies often failed to protect activists, and in some cases actively participated in repression. This hostility made participation in the movement a profound act of courage, requiring individuals to risk their safety, livelihoods, and lives. By the end of the 1950s, it was clear that the civil rights movement had permanently altered the political and moral landscape of the United States. Segregation was no longer an unquestioned norm. It was a contested system under constant challenge. Major events of the decade exposed the contradictions between American ideals and American practices, forcing the nation to confront its own conscience. While full equality was still far from achieved, the foundations for transformative change had been firmly established. The courage displayed during these years ensured that the struggle for justice would continue with greater strength, visibility, and determination in the decade to come. Section 4, Legacy of the 1950s and Martin Luther King Jr. The civil rights movement of the 1950s laid the foundation for the major victories of the 1960s, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Martin Luther King Jr.'s leadership helped define the moral vision of the movement. He believed that justice could be achieved without hatred, and that love and nonviolence were stronger than fear and oppression. His speeches and actions reshaped how Americans understood equality, citizenship, and democracy. Beyond laws and court rulings, the movement changed the soul of America. It forced the nation to confront its contradictions and inspired future movements for justice around the world. The courage shown by ordinary people, students, workers, ministers, and families, proved that history is not only shaped by presidents and courts, but by citizens who refuse to accept injustice. The 1950s civil rights movement remains one of the most powerful chapters in American history, and Martin Luther King Jr. stands as a lasting symbol of hope, courage, and moral leadership. By the mid-1950s, the struggle for civil rights in the United States entered a new phase, defined by leadership, mass participation, and a clear moral direction. At the center of this transformation stood Martin Luther King Jr., a young Baptist minister whose ideas and actions reshaped the movement. Unlike earlier efforts that focused mainly on courtrooms and legal arguments, this phase brought ordinary people into the streets, churches, and public spaces, turning civil rights into a nationwide moral debate. Martin Luther King Jr. did not begin his journey as a radical revolutionary. He was raised in Atlanta, Georgia, in a family deeply rooted in the Black church. From childhood, he experienced racial discrimination firsthand, including moments when white friends were suddenly forbidden to play with him. These early experiences left a lasting impression, teaching him that racism was not only cruel but deeply irrational. At the same time, his home emphasized discipline, education, and faith, shaping his belief that moral character mattered as much as political action. King's academic path played a crucial role in shaping his leadership. He studied theology and philosophy, encountering ideas that would later define his approach to activism. One of the most influential was the philosophy of nonviolence, practiced by Mahatma Gandhi. King saw in Gandhi's methods a powerful strategy that aligned with Christian teachings of love and forgiveness. Nonviolence for King was not passive submission but active resistance that challenged injustice without destroying human dignity. He believed that violence would only deepen hatred and delay true reconciliation. The defining moment that launched King into national leadership came in Montgomery, Alabama, in 1955. When Rosa Parks refused to give up her bus seat to a white passenger, her arrest sparked outrage within the Black community. Local leaders quickly organized a boycott of the city's bus system, demanding an end to segregation. Martin Luther King Jr., only 26 years old at the time, was chosen to lead the effort largely because he was new to the city and not yet entangled in local rivalries. What followed was one of the most significant acts of collective resistance in American history. For over a year, African Americans in Montgomery refused to ride segregated buses. Workers walked miles to their jobs, organized carpools, and endured harassment and threats. King emerged as the public face of the boycott, delivering speeches that emphasized discipline, unity, and moral purpose. He consistently reminded participants that their goal was not revenge but justice. The boycott placed King under intense pressure. His home was bombed, he was arrested, and he received constant death threats. Despite these dangers, he refused to abandon nonviolence. Instead of calling for retaliation, he urged calm and faith, insisting that responding with violence would betray the movement's moral foundation. This unwavering commitment strengthened his credibility and inspired trust among followers who saw in him a leader willing to suffer alongside them. In 1956, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation on public buses was unconstitutional, ending the Montgomery Bus Boycott in victory. This success demonstrated that organized, peaceful protest could dismantle segregation and force legal change. It also elevated King to national prominence. Newspapers, radio, and television introduced him to audiences across the country, making him one of the most recognizable voices of the civil rights movement. Following Montgomery, King helped establish the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, an organization dedicated to coordinating nonviolent protest across the South. The SCLC brought together ministers and community leaders who shared a commitment to peaceful resistance and moral leadership. King's role within the organization was not authoritarian. He saw himself as a servant leader whose responsibility was to inspire, guide, and unify rather than command. King's philosophy of nonviolence rested on several core principles. He believed that injustice must be confronted directly, that suffering could educate and transform opponents, and that love had the power to break cycles of hatred. Nonviolence also exposed the brutality of segregation. When peaceful protesters were beaten or jailed, the contrast between their dignity and their treatment forced the nation to confront uncomfortable truths. King understood that moral clarity could be a stronger weapon than physical force. Throughout the late 1950s, King traveled extensively, speaking in churches, colleges, and public halls. His speeches blended religious imagery with references to the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, framing civil rights as a fulfillment of America's founding promises rather than a rejection of them. This approach allowed him to reach beyond black audiences and appeal to the conscience of white Americans who believed in democratic ideals but had not yet confronted racial injustice. Leadership at a heavy personal cost. King faced criticism from segregationists who viewed him as a threat, as well as from some within the black community who believed nonviolence was too slow or too gentle. He lived under constant surveillance, endured imprisonment, and struggled with exhaustion and fear. Yet he remained committed to his vision, convinced that moral leadership required sacrifice. By the end of the 1950s, Martin Luther King Jr. had become more than an individual leader. He had become a symbol of a new kind of resistance. His rise marked a turning point in the civil rights movement, shifting it from isolated struggles into a coordinated moral campaign. Under his influence, ordinary people began to see themselves as participants in history, capable of reshaping their nation through courage, discipline, and faith. This new phase laid the groundwork for the larger battles and historic victories that would define the movement in the years to come. As the civil rights movement moved beyond the 1950s, its long-term impact began to reshape the legal, political, and moral foundations of the United States. The groundwork laid during the early struggles, community organizing, nonviolent resistance, and moral leadership, made it possible for the nation to confront segregation at a deeper level. What began as localized protests and court cases evolved into a nationwide demand for justice that could no longer be ignored. The legacy of the movement was most clearly reflected in the historic legislative victories of the 1960s. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed segregation in public places and banned discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It marked a decisive break from the Jim Crow system that had defined American life for generations. Soon after, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 removed the barriers that had prevented African Americans from exercising their right to vote. Literacy tests, poll taxes, and other tools of voter suppression were outlawed, restoring political power to millions who had long been excluded from democracy. These legal changes were not gifts from the government. They were the direct result of sacrifice and struggle. Ordinary men and women faced arrests, beatings, economic hardship, and death to force the nation to live up to its ideals. Their courage transformed civil rights from a legal argument into a moral imperative. The movement demonstrated that peaceful protest, when sustained and disciplined, could expose injustice and compel reform, even in the face of violent opposition. Martin Luther King Jr.'s influence extended far beyond specific laws. His philosophy of nonviolence reshaped how Americans understood protest, power, and patriotism. He argued that true love of country meant holding it accountable to its highest principles. By framing civil rights as a fulfillment of America's founding promises, King helped bridge racial divide and appealed to the conscience of the nation. His speeches and actions continue to inspire movements for justice around the world. The movement also transformed American society in less visible but equally important ways. It challenged deeply rooted social attitudes, forcing individuals and institutions to confront prejudice and inequality. Schools, workplaces, and neighborhoods slowly began to change. Representation of African Americans in politics, media, and public life increased, opening doors that had long been closed. While racism did not disappear, it could no longer operate unquestioned or unchallenged. The sacrifices of the movement's leaders and participants came at a heavy cost. Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination in 1968 shocked the nation and revealed how threatening the demand for equality remained. Yet his death did not silence the movement. Instead, it underscored the urgency of its mission. His legacy became a moral compass, reminding future generations that progress often requires courage, persistence, and a willingness to suffer for justice. The civil rights movement also left an enduring lesson about the power of ordinary people. It proved that history is not shaped only by presidents, courts, or armies, but by citizens who refuse to accept injustice. Students, workers, ministers, and families, many of whose names are unknown, played essential roles in changing the nation's direction. Their collective action demonstrated that democracy depends on participation and moral responsibility. Today, the legacy of the civil rights movement remains deeply relevant. Ongoing debates about equality, voting rights, policing, and social justice trace their roots to the struggles of the 1950s and 1960s. The movement's successes remind us that progress is possible, while its unfinished work reminds us that justice requires constant vigilance. When viewed as a whole, the story of the civil rights movement is not only a chapter in American history, but a testament to the human spirit. It is the story of people who believed that dignity was non-negotiable and that love could overcome hatred. From the quiet endurance of segregated communities to the moral leadership that challenged a nation's conscience, the movement permanently reshaped the United States. Its legacy stands as a reminder that freedom is not inherited automatically. It is claimed, defended, and renewed by each generation.